Lyra watched the green light of a medical scanner flicker across her rusted wrist restraints as a man with a war criminal's patch knelt in the sand above her. The hum of the device was the only sound in the white waste of Oceanine. Her vision blurred, caught between the glare of the iridescent dunes and the sharp black embroidery of the Iron Vanguard crest on the stranger's sleeve. She tried to pull away, but her muscles were leaden, her breath a shallow rattle against the heat, which meant the readings were wrong. Or he was. You found yourself at the edge of the galaxy's graveyard. If you're ready to see what remains when the armor comes off, subscribe and stay for the recovery. Now, let's go back to where the dust began to settle. 11 days earlier, the station's water recycler had broken for the third time that week. That was the sort of crisis Lyra Kalin was used to in exile, a mundane failure of mechanics that mirrored her own slow decline. Oceanine was where the Xylari sent their shame to rot, and she was the heaviest burden it ever held. She spent her hours pacing the perimeter of her lean-to, the bone-white sand invasive and relentless, finding its way into her boots, her rations, and the deep, jagged scars across her abdomen. She was a ghost. Once she had been the pride of the Xylari elite, a commander whose word moved fleets. Then came the burning of Krios Prime. When the order came to level the civilian sectors, Lyra had looked at a human child, small, terrified and utterly inconsequential to the war effort, and she had chosen the child. She had defied the high command to pull one life from the fire. For that mercy, she was stripped of her rank, her home, and her future. The descent to this wasteland had been brutal. The atmospheric shearing had torn the life from her womb before she even hit the ground, leaving her with a hollow ache that no amount of silence could fill. I forgot what it felt like to breathe without the weight of armor pressing into my ribs, she often thought, staring at the iridescent horizon. But the weight of the grief was heavier than any plastoid plating. Sunlight on Oceanine didn't just illuminate, it scoured. Lyra had wandered too far into the radiation zones, her strength finally buckling under the heat. She lay in the sand, her fingers brushing the rusted metal of her wrist restraints, the permanent markers of her status as a political cast-off. A shadow fell over her. Kalen Voss didn't look like a savior. He looked like wreckage. He was a scavenger, draped in moth-eaten tactical gear, his face obscured by a filtered mask. He moved with the practiced economy of a man who kept death on schedule. When he saw the Xylari woman collapsed in the dunes, he didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for a medical stimulant. He dragged her to a makeshift shelter carved into a limestone overhang. As the stimulant hissed into her veins, Lyra's eyes snapped open. She saw the crest on his sleeve. The Iron Vanguard, the very unit that had led the massacre at Aurelius Pass. The air in the small cave grew tight. Lyra's hand, trembling but determined, reached for a jagged piece of scrap metal on the floor. Why are you still here? The war ended years ago, but some of us are still fighting the ghosts. Tell me in the comments if you think some sins are too heavy to wash away. Voss didn't flinch. He simply sat back, opening a tin of recycled protein. The war didn't end, he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. It just ran out of fuel. The cave was a masterclass in survival, a hollowed-out rib of the planet where Voss had gathered the scraps of two civilizations. He didn't look at Lyra as he spoke, his attention fixed on a jagged cooling fan he was attempting to sharpen. He was a man who kept death on schedule, yet he had spent his precious medical stimulants on a dying enemy. You were at Aurelius Pass, Lyra said, her voice stronger now, though her hands still shook. She held the piece of scrap metal like a dagger. I saw your unit's mark in the debris. You didn't just fight, you erased people. Voss paused. He looked at her then, his eyes weary beneath the grime of a dozen dust storms. I kept the records. I was the one who signed the disposal orders. And you? I recognize the Kalen House sigil on those rusted restraints. You're the one who threw away a sector command for a human child who probably didn't live through the week. They sat in the silence of shared guilt, Two former enemies bonding over their complicity in a war they both deserted. The air in the cave was thick with the scent of ozone and old blood. Lyra realized with a sudden, sharp pang that she wasn't looking at a monster. She was looking at a mirror. A low-frequency mechanical pulse suddenly rattled the limestone walls. It was a rhythmic, bone-deep thrum that Lyra hadn't felt in years. "Drones," Voss hissed, kicking dust over the small heater. "Cloaked hunting craft. They finally caught the radiation spike from your suit." They didn't speak. There was no need for a plan. Their training took over, a lethal muscle memory that transcended their species' differences. Lyra forgot what it felt like to breathe without the weight of armor. But as she moved, following Voss out into the scouring wind of the cliffs, she realized she was breathing easier than she had in years. The tactical retreat was a blur of white sand and searing light. They moved like a single shadow, Voss providing cover fire with a modified rail pistol, while Lyra navigated the treacherous descent toward the hidden Xylari launch bay she'd mapped months ago. Beneath the observation deck, something shifted. The ground groaned as the ancient bay doors, buried under decades of silt, began to part. Inside sat a derelict escape pod, a needle of silver in the dark. "It's dead," Lyra shouted over the scream of the incoming drones. "Not if we bypass the core," Voss replied, slamming his combat knife into the pod's wiring panel. The green light of the medical scanner from the sand was replaced by the angry red strobes of the pod's emergency power. They worked in a frantic, silent harmony, hot wiring the engine while the hull hammered under drone fire. "We didn't launch for safety. We launched to finally become something more than wreckage." The ignition was a physical blow. The engines roared a violent rebirth that punched them through the atmosphere of Ossia 9 and into the velvet black of the void. Hours later, the civilian station Ares 9 loomed ahead, a cluster of lights that promised nothing but a bed and a lack of war. They were granted medical clearance after a tense hour in the airlock. Lyra stood in the sterile white of the station's processing center. A robotic orderly approached to catalog her belongings. She looked down at her hands. The rusted metal of her wrist restraints lay on the table, snapped open by Voss during the flight. They looked small now, pathetic. They represented her imprisonment and the shame the Xylari used to bind her, but they were just pieces of oxidized iron. She swept them into the recycling bin. Later she found Voss in the station's arboretum. The air smelled of damp earth and growing things, a scent so alien it made her eyes sting. They sat together on a bench, watching an artificial sunset bleed across the curved glass ceiling. "What now?" Voss asked. Lyra looked at her wrists, pale and bare. She didn't have an answer, but for the first time since Krios Prime, she wasn't looking back at the fire. She reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve where his Vanguard patch had been. He'd torn it off. Beneath the glass, the fake sun dipped low,